high upon the freezing, jagged ridges of Mount Hermon, where the brittle frost of the mountain meets the blinding, silent fire of the stars, there are stories. Stories written not in ink, but in the frantic grating of a wooden stylus against wet clay, the sharp scent of ozone on a desert wind, and the profound, silent awe of a man who looked directly into the heart of the sun. Welcome to Whispers of the Ancients, where we bring the forgotten echoes of history back to life through immersive narration and rich, detailed imagery. Today, we invite you to step into a world of ancient dust and celestial secrets, a world where simple shepherds followed their flocks under the watchful eyes of the stars, until those stars descended to walk among them, bringing forbidden knowledge that would forever sever humanity's bond with the earth. This is the story of Enoch, the quiet patriarch who became the first scribe to the stars, and of the Watchers, the radiant, seamless strangers who offered a primitive world the terrifying gift of perfection. This is the ascent of Enoch, the scribe, and the silver sphere. Chapter 1. The Descent on Hermon. The bruised, deep indigo of the pre-dawn sky over the high, rocky ridges of Mount Hermon is a cold, profoundly unwelcoming expanse. It is a sky that offers no comfort to the few scattered, nomadic shepherds who dare to brave the freezing altitudes to find late summer grazing for their stubborn flocks. The light here is faint, a pale, shivering silver cast entirely by the fading stars, struggling weakly against the overwhelming, suffocating blackness of the rugged terrain. The temperature is aggressive. A biting, brittle frost clings tightly to every exposed surface, creeping steadily into the thick, greasy woolen cloaks of the men, and turning their breath into sharp, jagged plumes of white vapor. The air smells intensely, cleanly of dry, frozen pine needles, pulverized rock, and the deep, uncomplicated scent of sleeping goats. It is a hard, simple, deeply understandable world. And then, without any warning, that simple world is entirely, irrevocably shattered. It does not begin with a tremendous, dramatic roar of fire, nor does it announce itself with the terrifying, chaotic trumpets of angry ancient gods. It begins with light. A single, blinding, perfectly unbroken beam of pure, unnatural white light suddenly pierces the heavy indigo sky. It is not the warm, comforting, spreading gold of a rising sun. It is an aggressive, clinical, entirely shadowless illumination that cuts through the darkness like a physical blade. The sheer intensity of the light instantly washes out the stars, throwing the jagged, rocky peaks of Hermon into stark, terrifying relief. The shepherds, waking suddenly from their frozen, huddled sleep, throw their calloused hands over their eyes, blinded and deeply confused by an artificial dawn that has arrived hours too early and from the entirely wrong direction. Following the light is a physical sensation that completely defies their understanding of the natural world. There is no howling, chaotic wind of a sudden mountain storm. Instead, the biting, brittle frost of the high altitude is suddenly, forcefully pushed away. It is replaced by a massive, invisible wave of perfectly regulated, deeply unnatural, synthetic warmth. The air is no longer freezing. It is instantly, comfortably, suspiciously temperate, carrying the heat of a low-burning hearth fire, but entirely lacking the comforting smell of wood smoke. Instead of smoke, the air is suddenly thick with a sharp, incredibly intense metallic tang. It is the overwhelming, highly charged scent of pure ozone, identical to the sharp, terrifying smell that immediately follows a massive, dangerously close strike of lightning, but sustained and magnified 100 times over. It completely obliterates the familiar scent of dry pine and sleeping animals, replacing the deeply earthy perfume of the mountain with the sterile, stinging scent of immense contained energy. As the massive, silent, seamlessly smooth silver vessel slowly descends through the atmosphere, it produces no roar of combustion. The sound of its arrival is a deep, continuous, sub-audible vibration. It is a frequency so incredibly low that it cannot truly be heard by the ears. It is felt directly, terrifyingly, inside the bones. It rattles the teeth in their sockets, vibrates the deep marrow of the spine, and causes the loose stones of the mountain to literally dance and chatter against one another in a frantic, localized earthquake. Enoch, a quiet, deeply observant patriarch who had simply walked up the mountain seeking a few days of silent meditation away from his large, noisy, complicated family, stands perfectly still. He feels the completely unnatural, highly charged static electricity filling the air. It causes the thick, dark hair on his forearms to stand rigidly on end and makes the heavy wool of his cloak cling aggressively to his legs. He watches, his eyes narrowed against the blinding light, as the massive, frictionless, completely silent sphere finally comes to rest upon the uneven, rocky summit of the mountain, entirely unbothered by the harsh terrain. The seamless silver door opens, and the watchers step out onto the dust of the earth. They are incredibly tall, moving with a fluid, effortless, highly disconcerting grace that speaks of anatomies not entirely bound by the heavy gravity of the world. They do not carry flaming swords or sing terrifying hymns of divine wrath. They carry strange, smooth instruments, and they look upon the terrified, cowering shepherds with an expression of calm, detached, intensely focused calculation. It is the beginning of the most profound, deeply ironic tragedy in the history of the world. These beings, these angels, have descended from the perfect, frictionless, silent harmony of the stars. And the very first, greatest gift they choose to bestow upon the simple, quiet, pastoral humans of the earth is the gift of agonizing, backbreaking, completely overwhelming manual labor. Within a matter of weeks, the quiet, frozen slopes of Mount Hermon and the surrounding valleys are entirely transformed. The Watchers, possessing knowledge spanning the vast, terrifying mechanics of the cosmos, look at the humans, people perfectly content to simply follow their goats, eat flatbread, and sleep under the stars, and decide that what these humans desperately need is the ability to forge heavy metals and crush complex chemical cosmetics. The profound cosmic irony is entirely lost on the eager, deeply impressionable humans. They readily, happily trade the peaceful, slow-paced life of the wandering shepherd for the exhausting, burning, permanently scarring labor of the forge, simply because incredibly tall, glowing strangers from the sky suggested it was a magnificent idea. Enoch watches in quiet, affectionate bemusement as his own people eagerly embrace this terrible, exhausting new knowledge. He stands near the newly constructed, incredibly crude clay crucibles of Azazel, the watcher who has taken it upon himself to teach the harsh, unforgiving art of metallurgy. The light here is no longer the blinding white of the ship. It is the mesmerizing, terrifyingly bright, fluid orange glow of liquid copper bubbling furiously within the thick clay walls. It is a beautiful, deeply dangerous light that casts frantic, dancing, demonic shadows against the rocky walls of the canyon. The temperature is no longer the biting frost of the mountain or the synthetic warmth of the ship. It is the blistering, skin-tightening, entirely aggressive heat of a forced air furnace. A heat that instantly evaporates the sweat from a man's brow and threatens to singe the very hair from his head. The sharp, clean smell of the ozone has been entirely replaced by a heavy, suffocating, intensely, deeply unpleasant stench. It smells of burning sulfur, of incredibly hot, pulverized charcoal, and of the sickly, sweet smell of singed human hair and blistered skin. It is an atmosphere of pure, unadulterated suffering, willingly embraced. The sound of the valley is entirely devoid of the peaceful, scattered bleating of sheep or the soft, carrying notes of a wooden flute. It has been replaced by the rhythmic, deafening, deeply exhausting ringing of heavy stone hammers striking crude, cooling metal against flat rocks. It is a harsh, violent, metallic percussion that echoes endlessly through the mountains, a relentless, driving heartbeat of early primitive industry. The men, their faces streaked heavily with black soot and their eyes wide with the manic, intense focus of creation, pull the glowing, dangerously hot metal from the fires. The touch of this new world is brutal and entirely unforgiving. The intense, radiating heat blisters their calloused hands despite the thick leather wraps they desperately employ. They lift the heavy, unyielding, incredibly dense weight of the very first crude iron swords, marveling at the sharp, deadly edges they have somehow managed to painfully drag out of the dirt. Enoch sits quietly on a cool, shadowed rock, far enough away from the blistering heat of the furnaces to breathe the cleaner air. He watches a young man, a boy who just last month had been perfectly happy chasing a stray lamb through a quiet meadow, now completely covered in black soot, coughing violently from the sulphurous smoke, his hands wrapped in bloody rags, grinning triumphantly as he holds up a heavy, jagged piece of sharpened iron. It is a deeply absurd, profoundly human moment. The heavens have literally opened up. Beings of unimaginable power and intelligence have descended from the terrifying, beautiful void of the stars. And humanity's immediate, enthusiastic response is to enthusiastically invent entirely new, incredibly complicated ways to make themselves tired, dirty, and miserable. Enoch sits quietly in the shadows of the canyon, rubbing his tired eyes and wondering deeply about the strange, heavy burdens of this new, incredibly loud and intensely hot knowledge as the rhythmic ringing of the hammers continues endlessly into the encroaching night. Chapter 2. The Burden of the Gods. The harsh, unrelenting light of the midday sun beating down upon the Levantine desert is no longer the clean, purifying brilliance that Enoch remembers from his youth. It has become a hazy, deeply oppressive, dust-choked glare that struggles to push its way through a thick, permanent suspension of pulverized topsoil and crushed rock. The sky is stripped of its vibrant, pristine blue, replaced by a bruised, suffocating canopy of pale, sickly ochre. Occasionally, this terrifyingly bright, hazy illumination is abruptly, violently blocked out entirely. Massive, sweeping, terrifyingly long shadows suddenly pass over the cracked earth, completely plunging the baking desert into a brief, sudden, unnatural twilight before the blistering sun fiercely reclaims the land. The temperature of this ruined landscape is a profound, aggressive, and entirely inescapable baking heat. The comforting, scattered copses of ancient cedar and sturdy oak that once offered a cool, deeply shadowed sanctuary from the midday sun have been completely, systematically eradicated. The earth, entirely stripped of its protective green canopy and its complex holding network of deep roots, simply absorbs the raw, unfiltered fury of the sun and radiates it back upward like the open door of a massive geological kiln. The heat rises in thick, visible, violently shimmering waves, distorting the horizon and making the distant, towering figures moving across the plains appear to twist and ripple like dark, impossibly large, liquid columns. The smell of the world has shifted from the sweet, dry perfume of wild sage and blooming desert flowers to an atmosphere of profound, tragic, and deeply unpleasant exhaustion. The overriding scent is the overwhelming, sour, intensely pungent musk of massive, heavily overworked bodies sweating profusely under the baking sun. It is a thick, animalistic odor that completely dominates the stagnant air. Mixed into this heavy, musky stench is the sharp, deeply tragic metallic tang of dying, desperately thirsty crops, and the heavy, earthy smell of ancient, fertile topsoil being endlessly, violently churned into fine, dead dust by thousands of incredibly heavy footsteps. The sound of the valley is no longer the peaceful, carrying silence of the deep desert, punctuated only by the occasional, comforting bleat of a stray goat or the soft whistling of the dry wind through the rocks. It has been replaced by a deep, rhythmic, terrifyingly localized seismic tremor. It is the sound of incredibly heavy, impossibly massive footsteps vibrating continuously and aggressively through the deep bedrock of the earth. The sound does not enter through the ears, it enters through the soles of the feet, a deep, resonant, bruising thud that travels directly up the spine and rattles the teeth in the jaw. It is a slow, deliberate, terrifying drumbeat of absolute, unyielding industrial progress. The touch of the earth beneath Enoch's worn, cracked leather sandals is deeply, profoundly tragic. The once fertile soil, which had held the precious winter rains and supported the simple, wandering flocks of his people for generations, is now dry, deeply cracked, and completely desperately thirsty. It trembles continuously, violently protesting the unnatural, crushing weight that is constantly pressed upon it. To kneel and run a calloused hand across the dirt is to feel the dry, brittle, lifeless texture of a world that is being rapidly, systematically consumed. The Watchers, in their infinite, terrifyingly detached cosmic wisdom, had not stopped at simply teaching humanity the exhausting, dirty secrets of metallurgy and complex chemical cosmetics. They had looked upon the simple, frail, easily tired human bodies struggling to build crude stone walls and clear small patches of rocky land, and they had decided, with terrifying clinical efficiency, to engineer a vastly superior, deeply specialized labor force. These new beings, these Nephilim or giants, are not the roaring, chaotic, mindless monsters of later, heavily embellished mythology. They are towering, flawlessly engineered, highly specialized, and incredibly efficient biological machines. They stand as tall as the ancient cedars they so easily uproot, their massive, heavily corded bodies designed entirely for the singular, unyielding purpose of monumental physical labor. They do not sleep. They do not sing. They simply work, fueled by an incredibly voracious, entirely terrifying, and deeply unsustainable metabolism. The cosmic irony of this supposed gift from the heavens is staggering and entirely, tragically apparent to the quiet, observant patriarch sitting in the dust. The heavens had provided humanity with the ultimate, tireless workforce to ease their physical burdens. But these incredibly massive, deeply hungry laborers require a truly terrifying amount of pure biological fuel simply to maintain their monumental efforts. The humans, who had originally cheered the arrival of the giants as the end of their own back-breaking labor, now find themselves working 10 times as hard, desperately, frantically trying to grow enough wheat, barley, and livestock simply to feed the massive, towering creatures who are supposedly working for them. It is an incredibly absurd, deeply exhausting, and rapidly failing economic system. The simple, sustainable, deeply pastoral life of the desert nomads has been violently transformed into a frantic, panicked, completely unsustainable industrial agriculture entirely dedicated to feeding an army of silent, towering, bottomless pits. Enoch watches from the small, pathetic shade of a single, deeply withered olive tree as 3 of the massive Nephilim work in the near distance. They are methodically, silently tearing the side off a limestone hill, their massive hands ripping massive boulders from the earth with the terrifying ease of a child plucking pebbles from a stream. They are building a massive, incomprehensible stone structure at the direction of the Watchers. A structure that serves no discernible practical human purpose, but requires the complete, total ecological devastation of the surrounding valley to construct. The human population is starving, their flocks entirely decimated to feed the insatiable giant labourers, their fields stripped bare and trampled into dead grey dust. They had prayed to the heavens for relief from their difficult lives, and the heavens had answered by sending them a highly efficient, incredibly tall, deeply hungry apocalypse. It is to Enoch, the quiet, deeply literate, slightly bemused scribe, that the desperate, exhausted leaders of the human tribes finally turn. They do not ask him to lead a violent, entirely suicidal rebellion against the towering giants or the blindingly advanced watchers. They ask him to do the only thing a deeply civilized, highly bureaucratic society can think to do when faced with an overwhelming, world-ending ecological disaster caused by extraterrestrial interference. They ask him to write a very strongly worded letter of complaint to the management. Enoch sits cross-legged in the dry, trembling dirt, his worn, deeply sun-baked face set in lines of quiet, profound exhaustion. He holds a thick, damp, surprisingly heavy slab of fresh river clay carefully in his lap. The touch of the wet clay is a brief, glorious, cooling luxury against his sweating palms. In his right hand, he holds a carefully carved, perfectly wedge-shaped wooden stylus. The process of drafting the petition is slow, rhythmic, and deeply, intensely hypnotic. He does not write with flowing, expressive ink. He presses the sharp edge of the wooden stylus deeply and deliberately into the yielding mud. The sound is soft, gritty, and deeply satisfying, a tiny, quiet rebellion of order and communication against the deafening, vibrating roar of the massive, world-destroying labor echoing across the valley. He writes of the dying grass, the starving sheep, and the incredibly thirsty, deeply cracked earth. He writes of the terrifying, unsustainable hunger of the towering laborers and the profound, deeply exhausted misery of the humans who are desperately trying to feed them. He translates the incredibly complex, deeply painful tragedy of a dying ecosystem into neat, highly organized, perfectly spaced rows of wedge-shaped cuneiform marks pressed tightly into the wet mud. There is a quiet, deeply profound humor in the image of this single, aging, dusty man sitting in the shadow of massive, alien-engineered devastation, earnestly trying to summarize the end of the world on a piece of mud, so that he can present it to beings who travel between the stars. He is a deeply practical man facing a profoundly impractical, terrifyingly advanced universe, and he is armed with absolutely nothing but a stick and a good vocabulary. When the heavy clay tablet is finally filled with the dense, precise, deeply desperate language of the petition, Enoch sets it carefully aside to bake and harden in the blistering, unforgiving heat of the midday sun. He wipes his deeply calloused, mud-stained hands slowly on the rough, heavy wool of his tunic, taking a long, ragged, incredibly dry breath of the dust-choked air. He stands up, his aging knees popping loudly in protest against the heavy gravity of the earth. He secures the hardened, heavy clay tablet carefully into a woven leather satchel, slinging the strap diagonally across his broad, tired shoulders. He does not carry an iron sword or a heavy wooden spear. A weapon would be entirely, laughably useless against the towering giants or the blinding light of the Watcher's ship. He carries only the heavy, physical weight of his people's desperate, incredibly polite plea for survival. He turns his face toward the high, rocky, deeply bruised ridges of Mount Hermon, where the massive, silent, seamlessly smooth silver vessel still rests, a terrible, gleaming, frictionless intruder upon the dusty, heavily textured landscape of his home. Enoch begins the long, incredibly hot, deeply exhausting walk toward the mountain, his worn leather sandals crunching softly against the dry, dead earth, his small, insignificant shadow stretching out bravely ahead of him as he prepares to deliver his muddy letter to the stars. Chapter 3. The Seamless Door. The journey up the rocky, uneven slopes of Mount Hermon is a grueling, heavily textured ascent through a landscape defined entirely by its sharp imperfections. The air is thick with the scent of pulverized limestone and dry, ancient dust swirling chaotically in the unpredictable mountain thermals. The harsh, blinding light of the late afternoon sun casts long, jagged, aggressively black shadows behind every boulder, making the climb a treacherous exercise in careful, exhausting footwork. The temperature fluctuates wildly, offering the baking, stagnant heat of the desert floor one moment, and the sudden, biting, deeply uncomfortable chill of high-altitude shade the next. Enoch's worn leather sandals scrape and slide against the loose gravel, finding purchase only through constant, desperate friction. But as he finally crests the high ridge and approaches the massive, resting form of the command ship, the chaotic, imperfect reality of the natural world simply and entirely ceases to exist. The vessel does not rest upon the uneven ground so much as it completely ignores it. It is an immense, perfectly spherical construct of gleaming, seamless silver, completely devoid of any rivets, overlapping planks, or the heavy, comforting marks of a craftsman's hammer. It reflects the harsh sunlight with a pure, unadulterated brilliance that forces Enoch to shield his tired, dust-filled eyes. There is absolutely no smoke rising from it, no smell of burning wood or roasted meat, and no chaotic noise of human or animal life. It is a monument to absolute, terrifying perfection, resting quietly in a world made entirely of dirt. A perfectly circular, shadowless aperture opens smoothly on the lower curve of the sphere, revealing an airlock bathed in an incredibly pure, perfectly even white light. This light does not flicker like an oil lamp, nor does it cast the dancing, comforting shadows of a hearth-fire. It illuminates every single millimeter of the entryway with a flat, clinical, entirely inescapable brilliance that makes Enoch's heavily soiled, mud-stained tunic look profoundly offensive by comparison. Enoch hesitates for a long, heavy moment at the threshold. He is a man who understands the world entirely through its rough textures and strong smells. To step into this perfectly smooth, brightly lit void is to step completely out of his own universe. He tightens his grip on the leather satchel containing his heavy clay partition, takes a long, incredibly dry breath of the dusty mountain air, and steps through the aperture. The psychological and physical shock of the transition is immediate and profoundly overwhelming. The moment his worn, leather-clad foot crosses the threshold, the rough, uneven, grinding friction of the rocky earth vanishes completely. The floor beneath him is impossibly smooth, entirely devoid of seams or grain, yet it yields very slightly to his weight with a soft, synthetic compliance that is far more unsettling than hard stone. It is a surface designed to entirely eliminate the concept of friction, a concept that has defined every single step of Enoch's long life. The temperature change strikes him with the physical force of a sudden blow. The chaotic, baking heat of the desert mountain is instantly replaced by an environment of incredibly crisp, perfectly regulated, aggressively chilled air. It is a cold that does not bite or sting like a winter frost. It simply exists, constant and unyielding, instantly chilling the heavy, accumulated sweat on Enoch's brow and causing him to shiver violently beneath his thick, coarse woolen cloak. But it is the smell of the ship, or rather, the absolute, terrifying absence of it, that truly shocks his system. Since the moment of his birth, Enoch's lungs have been filled with the thick, complex, deeply rich scents of the earth. He is accustomed to the heavy musk of animals, the sharp tang of wood smoke, the sweet perfume of crushed sage, and the sour reality of unwashed bodies. Here, inside the airlock, there is absolutely nothing. The air is so completely sterile, so aggressively filtered, that drawing a breath feels strangely empty, almost as if he is not breathing at all. The only faint, incredibly subtle scent he can detect is the sharp, clean, deeply unsettling tang of heavily ionized air, a smell that brings the terrifying memory of a lightning strike to the very front of his mind. As he steps fully into the chamber, the massive, seamless door behind him closes. There is no heavy, reassuring slam of a wooden plank against a stone frame, no rattle of iron hinges. There is only a soft, continuous, highly pressurized hissing sound, followed by the absolute ringing silence of a perfectly hermetic seal. The familiar, chaotic noise of the mountain wind is completely severed. The silence inside the ship is so profound, so incredibly heavy and absolute, that Enoch can clearly hear the frantic, terrified, rapid beating of his own heart echoing loudly within his chest. He is guided forward by the tall, perfectly silent watchers, moving deeper into the complex, gleaming bowels of the ship. They lead him to a small, circular chamber lined with strange, deeply contoured seats that appear to have been molded from a soft, dark, incredibly dense gel. The watchers gesture silently for him to sit. Enoch lowers himself cautiously into one of the seats. The material is strange, lacking the comforting, woven texture of wool or the stiff resilience of leather. It instantly, intelligently molds itself to the exact contours of his tired, aching back and legs, gripping him with a soft, perfectly distributed, inescapable firmness. As he settles into the chair, a subtle, deeply comforting warmth begins to bleed slowly into his spine from the synthetic gel, aggressively pushing back the crisp chill of the cabin air. It is a level of pure, unadulterated physical comfort that no human being has ever experienced in the history of the world, and Enoch finds it deeply, thoroughly suspicious. The pure, blinding white light of the cabin slowly begins to dim, replaced by the soft, pulsing, rhythmic glow of thousands of small, incredibly complex internal displays that cover the curved walls of the chamber. They cast a strange, shifting, deeply colourful illumination across Enoch's deeply lined, sun-baked face. Then the true terror of the ascent begins. It does not start with a violent, chaotic explosion of fire, nor does it violently shake the cabin to pieces like a panicked runaway chariot. It begins with a deep, rising, incredibly powerful vibration that seems to originate not from engines, but from the very fabric of the ship itself. It is a harmonic resonance that vibrates fiercely through the incredibly smooth floor, up through the intelligent gel seat, and directly into the deep marrow of Enoch's bones. And then comes the weight. It is not a sudden, jerking acceleration, but a smooth, relentless, incredibly terrifying multiplication of gravity. The invisible, comforting tether of the earth, which has held Enoch safely to the ground for his entire life, suddenly turns aggressively malicious. An immense, invisible hand presses directly, heavily, and fiercely against his chest, driving him deeply into the yielding material of the seat. The skin on his face feels suddenly, painfully tight, pulled backward by an incredible, unseen force. His arms, resting on the smooth armrests, become so impossibly, ridiculously heavy that he could not lift a single finger even if his life depended upon it. The breath is forcefully, violently squeezed from his lungs, leaving him gasping shallowly, his mouth open in a silent, desperate rictus of pure, unadulterated physical shock. The heavy clay tablet in his leather satchel, the deeply desperate, heavily worded petition from the starving humans of the earth, presses into his side with the weight of a massive, solid boulder. The cosmic irony is profound, though Enoch is currently far too occupied with trying to keep his internal organs from collapsing to fully appreciate it. He is a man who came to humbly deliver a piece of mud to the heavens, and the heavens have responded by attempting to crush him with the sheer, undeniable physics of planetary departure. The deep, powerful vibration of the anti-gravity drives continues to rise in pitch and intensity, building to a continuous, deafening, bone-rattling crescendo that completely drowns out his own frantic, shallow breathing. The soft, pulsing lights of the cabin blur into long, colourful, chaotic streaks as his vision begins to violently narrow. He is trapped, entirely helpless, pinned to a glowing chair inside a seamless silver sphere as the heavy, dusty, beautifully imperfect world of his entire existence falls rapidly, violently away beneath him. The pressure continues to build, a relentless, crushing tide of sheer physical force, until the darkness completely claims the edges of his sight, pulling the exhausted, terrified scribe deeply into the void. Chapter 4. The Fading Blue. The deeply terrifying, crushing weight of the ascent does not release its violent grip on Enoch gradually. For what feels like an entire lifetime, he is pinned helplessly to the strangely yielding synthetic material of the seat, his lungs burning with the desperate need for air, and his vision reduced to a dark, swimming, chaotic tunnel of frantic, useless colour. He is a simple man who has spent his entire, deeply pastoral existence bound firmly and comfortably to the dry dust of the earth, and the violent, aggressively physical act of tearing him away from that familiar, reliable gravity is a profoundly traumatizing, deeply disorienting experience. The deep, bone-rattling, entirely incomprehensible vibration of the anti-gravity drives continues its relentless, deafening, highly localized hum, shaking the very marrow in his aging bones until his teeth physically ache with the impossible strain. And then, with a suddenness that makes his frantically beating heart stumble painfully in his chest, the terrible, suffocating pressure simply miraculously vanishes. The overwhelming, crushing force that had been pressing him so deeply into the intelligent gel of the chair evaporates entirely. In its place, it leaves behind an incredibly strange, completely bewildering, deeply unsettling sensation of absolute, impossible weightlessness. The deep, roaring, terrifying vibration of the ship's furious ascent ceases instantly, leaving behind a profound, ringing, heavy silence that feels almost physically painful against his abused eardrums. It is a silence so complete, so completely devoid of the chaotic, rushing, atmospheric friction of the natural world that it takes Enoch a long, highly panicked, completely breathless moment to realize that he has not, in fact, gone entirely deaf. Slowly, carefully, and with a great deal of deeply ingrained apprehension, he opens his tightly squeezed eyes. The soft, pulsing, rhythmic, somewhat alarming lights of the cabin displays have successfully settled into a steady, calming, deeply clinical, and perfectly even illumination. He is no longer being aggressively pressed into the seat. In fact, he realizes with a sudden, massive jolt of pure, unadulterated, entirely primal panic, he is no longer truly sitting at all. His heavy, dust-covered body is hovering freely, held loosely and gently in place only by the subtle, incredibly intelligent moulding contours of the synthetic gel material. The profound, constant, deeply annoying ache in his aging knees, and the deep, familiar, lingering, sharp pain in his lower back. Heavy, physical burdens he has carried uncomplainingly every single day since his early youth have miraculously, impossibly, and completely vanished. The heavy, dragging, absolutely reliable anchor of the earth has simply, casually let him go. Enoch raises a trembling, heavily calloused, deeply sun-baked hand before his face. It requires absolutely no physical effort whatsoever. The heavy limb feels impossibly, incredibly light, floating smoothly upward with the gentle, terrifying, completely effortless ease of a dry leaf caught upon a soft summer breeze. The heavy, densely woven woolen fabric of his thick desert cloak, previously plastered aggressively and painfully to his heavily sweating skin by the terrible, crushing gravity of the launch, now drifts loosely, strangely, and beautifully around his body. The coarse, greasy fibers brush softly and incredibly lightly against his sweaty cheeks in a bizarre, deeply mesmerizing, slow-motion, almost aquatic dance. The air within the small, completely enclosed cabin is perfectly, flawlessly still. It is entirely lacking the chaotic, unpredictable, heavily scented currents of a dry desert wind. It is maintained at a perfectly neutral, deeply comfortable, entirely unremarkable temperature that feels strangely thick, almost like resting effortlessly in a pool of incredibly clear, highly temperate water. It cools the thick, sticky layer of nervous, highly panicked sweat that still aggressively coats Enoch's deeply lined forehead and the back of his neck. The sharp, acrid smell of his own primal fear is stark, completely undeniable, and deeply noticeable to him in this perfectly controlled environment. The cabin itself is utterly, completely, terrifyingly scentless. A sterile, aggressively filtered, deeply unnatural void that offers absolutely no comforting information to his desperately searching, highly sensitive nose. The only familiar, grounding scent he can possibly detect is the incredibly faint, beautifully earthy smell of the dry, pulverized Levantine dust, slowly, inexorably shedding from the thick fibers of his floating woolen cloak. He watches, utterly mesmerized, profoundly shocked, and deeply bewildered, as a tiny, single, insignificant clump of dried river mud from the sole of his leather sandal breaks completely loose. Instead of falling heavily and predictably to the solid floor, it drifts slowly, lazily, incredibly gracefully upward, suspending itself perfectly in the bright, sterile, completely still air of the cabin. It is a tiny, beautiful, completely impossible, utterly casual defiance of every single natural, unyielding law he has ever known in his entire, deeply grounded life. A soft, deeply resonant, highly musical chime suddenly echoes clearly through the quiet, completely silent cabin. Without any further warning, the thick, entirely seamless metal wall directly in front of him begins to smoothly, completely silently slide away, parting like a curtain to reveal a massive, incredibly thick, perfectly clear observation window. The light that instantly, violently floods the small cabin is not the hazy, dust-choked, deeply yellow, comfortably diffused illumination of his desert home. It is a blinding, unfiltered, terrifyingly harsh, incredibly aggressive glare of pure, unmitigated, completely raw solar radiation striking directly against the incredibly thick glass of the viewport. It is a light so aggressive, so incredibly pure, and so entirely violent that it actively hurts the eyes, completely lacking the softening, protective, deeply comforting diffusion of a thick, breathable planetary atmosphere. Enoch quickly, instinctively raises a calloused hand to shield his face. He squints painfully against the fierce, unyielding glare, leaning his completely weightless body slightly, awkwardly forward, his breathing still shallow, rapid, and deeply panicked. He looks slowly out through the impossibly clear, entirely unblemished glass, fully expecting to see the familiar, rugged, snow-capped peaks of Mount Hermon, or perhaps the sprawling, dusty, deeply uneven expanse of the hot plains far below. Instead, he is violently, completely confronted with a breathtaking view that entirely, instantly shatters the very foundational bedrock of his deeply limited earthbound understanding. The familiar, comforting, incredibly bright blue canopy of the daytime sky, the protective dome that had roofed his world for his entire existence, is completely, terrifyingly gone. In its place is a creeping, deeply terrifying, incredibly vast, completely bottomless velvet blackness. It is not the simple, familiar darkness of a moonless, cloudy night. It is an absolute, profound, deeply textured, utterly complete void that seems to actively suck the very light from the room. And suspended entirely alone within this terrifying, beautiful, completely empty abyss is the blinding, unblinking, incredibly violent glare of the sun, burning with a fierce, diamond-hard, terrifying intensity directly against the absolute, infinite black. The profound, entirely cosmic, deeply absurd irony of his completely impossible situation washes heavily over him in a quiet, utterly breathless, completely overwhelming wave. Here he is, a simple, deeply practical, aging man who has spent his entire muddy life carefully, nervously observing the subtle changes in the wind to protect his fragile, stubborn flock of goats, suddenly floating completely effortlessly in a sterile, perfectly silent, frictionless room, staring directly and unblinkingly into the terrifying, unfiltered, completely empty abyss of the universe. He is entirely, completely, profoundly out of his depth, a tiny, dusty, deeply confused speck of simple humanity, completely adrift in a vast, terrifying sea of absolute, technological perfection. The ship slowly, gracefully begins to rotate, the silent, invisible, highly advanced thrusters making minute, completely unfelt adjustments to its orbital trajectory. As the thick viewport turns slowly away from the blinding, aggressive glare of the sun, the true, completely overwhelming, intensely majestic reality of their position is finally, beautifully revealed. The absolute darkness of space is suddenly, violently, perfectly interrupted by the incredibly massive, softly glowing, brilliantly curved, deeply saturated edge of the Earth itself. It is a staggering, deeply humbling, entirely incomprehensible sight. The entire planet is revealed as a massive, glowing, perfect sphere of deep, swirling, incredibly vibrant blues and brilliant, blindingly white, twisting clouds, suspended perfectly, silently, and completely alone in the absolute, terrifying nothingness of the void. The sheer, impossible, completely overwhelming scale of it presses heavily and frighteningly against his tiny, fragile mind, a beautiful, terrifying, deeply profound confirmation of the Watcher's impossible, forbidden knowledge. Enoch presses his calloused, dirt-stained fingertips gently against the cold, incredibly thick, perfectly smooth glass of the viewport. He stares down at the massive, glowing, beautifully silent world far below, entirely forgetting his lingering primal panic, entirely ignoring his sweating brow, and completely forgetting the heavy, desperately important clay tablet still strapped securely to his floating, weightless side. He is suspended perfectly in the silent, absolute void, watching the massive white clouds slowly, gracefully swirl across the bright blue face of the Earth. He is a deeply changed man, untethered from everything he ever knew, falling slowly, quietly, and completely into a state of profound, breathless, entirely absolute awe. Chapter 5. The Halls of Crystal and Plasma. The transition from the small, perfectly silent observation cabin into the vast, sprawling, interconnected corridors of the massive orbital station is a journey from profound, isolated awe into a state of sheer, overwhelming sensory overload. Enoch is guided gently, silently forward by his tall, seamlessly robed escorts, his worn leather sandals gliding strangely and effortlessly over the perfectly smooth, slightly yielding magnetic floor plating. The movement requires almost no physical exertion. The ship itself seems to anticipate his steps, carrying him along with a friction-free grace that feels deeply unnatural to a man whose entire life has been defined by the hard, grinding resistance of rock and sand. As the heavy, seamless metal doors part before him, Enoch is immediately confronted by a terrifying, deeply beautiful spectacle that his primitive mind struggles violently to categorize. In his own time, and in his own deeply limited vocabulary, he will later desperately attempt to describe this specific place to his terrified sons as a massive, towering house built entirely of pure crystal, surrounded by impossible, dancing tongues of living fire. But what he is actually observing is something infinitely more complex, highly engineered, and deeply functional. The walls of the massive, echoing corridor are not made of solid, opaque stone or thick, heavy timber. They are constructed entirely of an incredibly thick, perfectly transparent, highly advanced synthetic material that looks exactly like flawlessly polished ice. Behind these massive, perfectly clear panels runs the very lifeblood of the great station. It is a series of incredibly thick, complexly routed containment conduits, and through these conduits pulses a furious, hypnotic, violently bright stream of pure, highly energized plasma. The light generated by these massive flowing rivers of energy is absolutely staggering. It is a deeply saturated, violently bright, furiously pulsing shade of rich, vibrant purple, laced heavily with sudden, blinding flashes of pure white. It does not glow softly or steadily. It surges with a powerful, deeply rhythmic, almost biological intensity, casting frantic, chaotic, deeply colored shadows across Enoch's bewildered, dust-streaked face. The temperature within the massive corridor is a strange, highly contrasting, entirely artificial experience. The ambient air of the great hall is maintained at an aggressive, biting, perfectly regulated chill, a crisp coolness that keeps Enoch's breath frosting slightly in the sterile air. But radiating powerfully and intensely from the transparent walls is the localized, heavily shielded, but still fiercely undeniable heat of the contained plasma. As he walks, he passes through alternating, distinct bands of biting cold and sudden, intense, deeply radiant warmth, a completely baffling thermal landscape that entirely confuses his senses. The smell of the great station is equally sharp and completely foreign. The faint, earthy smell of the desert dust shedding from his cloak is now entirely overpowered by the intense, clinical, deeply metallic scent of highly energized machinery. It is a sharp, fiercely clean, slightly acidic odor that smells exactly like the heavy, highly charged air immediately surrounding a massive, freshly struck anvil, but magnified to a completely overwhelming degree. It is the scent of raw, contained power, completely devoid of any organic, comforting smells of life or growth. The sound of the corridor is a continuous, deafening, deeply resonant roar. It is not the chaotic, unpredictable noise of a storm, but the rhythmic, surging, incredibly powerful, rushing sound of millions of gallons of energized plasma flowing rapidly and continuously through the massive conduits. It is a deep, highly mechanical heartbeat, a steady, completely unnatural thrumming that vibrates heavily against Enoch's chest and rattles his aging teeth, drowning out the soft, hissing sound of his own frightened breathing. He is led deeper and deeper into the heart of the glowing, vibrating structure. A tiny, filthy, deeply confused speck of simple humanity moving slowly through the incredibly complex, roaring arteries of a highly advanced extraterrestrial machine. Finally, the long, plasma-lit corridor opens up into a massive, incredibly vast, perfectly circular central chamber. The walls here are completely opaque, forged from a dark, heavily textured, light-absorbing metal that offers a sudden, deeply welcome visual relief from the frantic, pulsing purple glare of the conduits. But the relief is incredibly short-lived. In the exact center of the vast, heavily shielded room sits the great commander of the station. Enoch's breath catches painfully in his dry, constricted throat, and he instinctively, desperately throws his calloused hands up to shield his fragile eyes. The being seated before him is not a tall, seamless, quietly observing humanoid like his escorts. It is a being of such incredibly dense, pure, terrifyingly intense energy that it simply cannot be looked upon directly. The light radiating from the commander is overwhelmingly, aggressively, completely perfectly white. It is a brilliance so absolute, so flawlessly pure, that it entirely obliterates all shadows within the massive room, filling every single corner with a harsh, flat, entirely inescapable illumination. To protect Enoch's deeply primitive, highly vulnerable retinas, his silent guides quickly step forward, producing a pair of incredibly dark, heavily polarized, transparent shielding lenses placing them gently but firmly over his eyes. Even through the heavy, darkening filters, the sheer, undeniable power of the being is absolutely staggering. The temperature in the room changes drastically. The crisp, regulated chill of the station is entirely banished, replaced by a wave of profound, absolute, unyielding heat radiating directly from the commander. It is a heat so intense, so perfectly focused, that it feels less like the comforting warmth of a fire, and much more like sheer, physical, aggressive pressure pressing heavily against Enoch's skin. The intense metallic scent of the machinery is completely, entirely obliterated in the presence of the commander. The air here simply smells of nothingness. A complete, overwhelming sensory overload that somehow loops entirely back around into a terrifying, absolute absence of all scent. The pure, highly concentrated energy seems to actively burn the very concept of smell directly out of the air. And then the commander speaks. The sound does not travel predictably through the air, vibrating against the delicate tympanic membranes of Enoch's ears. The voice entirely bypasses his physical senses, resonating directly, terrifyingly, and with absolute crystalline clarity inside the very bone of his skull. It is a voice of deep, perfect, incredibly patient resonance, entirely devoid of the chaotic, emotional fluctuations of human speech. It is the voice of a being that has watched the slow, grinding tectonic plates of planets shift and collide over millions of years. There is a deep, profound cosmic absurdity in the moment. Enoch, a man whose greatest, most pressing concern only a few hours ago was whether his oldest goat was going to survive the winter chill, is now standing in a highly shielded, heavily magnetized room, wearing strange, dark lenses, attempting to actively comprehend a being of pure, highly concentrated energy, communicating via direct neural resonance. He is deeply, profoundly, entirely out of his depth, grasping frantically at the very edges of an entirely incomprehensible, technologically terrifying universe. Enoch slowly, shakily lowers himself to his knees, not out of any ingrained, primitive religious terror or desperate, cowering supplication, but simply because the vibrating, overwhelming, completely inescapable physical pressure of standing in the direct presence of such an immense, highly concentrated power source has finally, completely exhausted the strength in his aging, earthbound legs. Chapter 6. The Engines of the Wind. The profound, vibrating, deeply religious silence that immediately follows the overwhelming, terrifying audience with the great commander is suddenly and aggressively broken. Enoch is gently but firmly led out of the perfectly circular central chamber by his tall, seamlessly robed escorts, passing out of the pristine, flawlessly polished, purple plasma-lit corridors, and descending heavily into the deeper, purely industrial, massively complex bowels of the great orbital station. The elegant, translucent architecture of the upper decks completely gives way to a raw, incredibly brutal, purely utilitarian nightmare of thick, exposed titanium grating, heavy pressure valves, and massive, densely riveted containment bulkheads. This is absolutely not a place designed for quiet observation, philosophical reflection, or peaceful meditation. This is the terrifying, roaring, violently beating heart of planetary manipulation. As Enoch steps out onto a surprisingly narrow, highly exposed, suspended metal catwalk, he is instantly assaulted by a dizzying, chaotic, intensely disorienting, and profoundly aggressive light show. The internal space before him is unbelievably vast, a cavernous, echoing, artificially enclosed megastructure that seems easily large enough to completely swallow the entirety of Mount Hermon without a single peak touching the sides. The crushing, heavy darkness of this immense cavern is constantly, violently, and rhythmically pierced by the strobe-like, terrifyingly bright flashing of massive amber and crimson warning lights. These intense, burning strobes serve only to briefly, terrifyingly illuminate the staggering, impossible scale of the machinery operating in the gloom. Impossibly massive, deeply curved titanium blades, hundreds of feet long and dozens of feet thick, rotating with a terrifying, absolute, frictionless silent speed in the hard vacuum just beyond the heavily shielded, incredibly thick, transparent bulkheads. The temperature in this deeply industrial section of the station is violently, chaotically unstable, creating a deeply confusing and physically punishing experience for a man who is intimately accustomed only to the slow, predictable, natural shifting of the desert seasons. As he walks nervously along the suspended grating, his hands gripping the railings tightly, he is suddenly forcefully hit by a direct blast of incredibly hot, aggressively compressed air venting automatically from a massive, unseen pressure valve. It is a heat so intense, so perfectly focused, that it feels exactly like stepping completely unprotected directly into the path of a roaring, open hearth forge. But only a few hesitant steps later, that intense, burning heat is instantly, brutally, and violently sucked away, replaced without any warning by the sudden, terrifyingly sharp, lung-freezing chill of a near-vacuum environment as massive, unseen automated airlocks cycle, heavily somewhere in the dark, pulling the precious warmth directly from the deep marrow of his aging bones. The smell of the megastructure is incredibly heavy, completely saturated, deeply elemental, and entirely overwhelming. It is the highly concentrated, aggressively raw, unfiltered scent of unborn artificial weather. It smells of incredibly dense, perfectly purified, superheated water vapor, of heavily ionized, electrically charged gases, and the sharp, deeply metallic, incredibly stinging tang of artificial manufactured ozone. It is the absolute, undeniable, overwhelming smell of a massive, terrifyingly violent summer thunderstorm, tightly compressed, perfectly organized, and neatly bottled within a sterile, unyielding metal can. The sound within the vast chamber is absolutely, entirely, completely deafening. It is a chest-crushing, incredibly low-frequency, deeply continuous rumble that entirely bypasses the fragile human eardrums and resonates directly, painfully, and violently within the hollow, vibrating cavities of the lungs and stomach. It is the terrifying, rhythmic, deeply mechanical roaring of planetary-scale atmospheric processes. Massive, impossible engines specifically designed to artificially churn, chemically heat, and violently propel millions upon millions of tons of breathable, perfectly mixed air down onto the primitive, completely unsuspecting, dirt-covered Earth, spinning silently and helplessly far below. Enoch grips the cold, sweating metal railing of the catwalk with desperately tight, thoroughly white-knuckled, heavily calloused hands. The touch of the station here is not the smooth, frictionless glide of the upper decks, but a constant, heavy, deeply unsettling, violent vibration. The thick, interlocking metal grating beneath his worn, cracked leather sandals rattles continuously, a frantic, highly mechanical shivering that forces his teeth to chatter violently together and makes his aging, deeply arthritic knees ache terribly with the sustained, agonizing strain of simply maintaining his balance. He stares out in absolute, horrified wonder at the portals of the wind, his primitive, earthbound mind desperately trying to somehow process the sheer, absurd, terrifyingly massive scale of the incredibly violent, fully automated machinery that is apparently completely responsible for the gentle, cooling evening breezes that he had always simply assumed were a gift to soothe his tired flocks. He is guided further down the violently vibrating catwalk, slowly moving away from the deafening, bone-crushing roar of the atmospheric processes and the spinning blades, and moving steadily toward a massive, heavily reinforced, completely utterly frost-covered security bulkhead set deep into the darkest wall of the cavern. As the incredibly thick, heavily insulated metal door slowly, heavily, and with a deep, grinding shudder pulls open, the violent, chaotic, deafening noise of the massive engines is entirely, instantly, and violently severed. It is replaced immediately by an atmosphere of such profound, ringing, absolute, terrifying silence that it actually feels physically heavy against the eardrums. This is the deepest, most secure containment vessel on the station, the terrifying frozen area that Enoch will later desperately and poetically attempt to describe to his deeply confused children as the eternal, lightless prison of the fallen stars. The light here is entirely, fundamentally different from the flashing, frantic, deeply aggressive crimson and amber strobes of the roaring engine room. It is an extremely dim, terribly pale, deeply sickly shade of artificial, clinical blue, barely strong enough to properly illuminate the vast, echoing, perfectly circular chamber. This weak, ghostly, deeply depressing light reflects dimly and coldly off thousands upon thousands of identical, perfectly smooth, heavily frosted glass and polished metal cylinders. These massive pods line the curved walls of the massive, silent bay, stretching endlessly upward into the deep gloom like a terrifying, perfectly silent, incredibly orderly, beautifully engineered honeycomb of the completely dead. The temperature change as he crosses the threshold is instantaneous, agonizing, and deeply, maliciously aggressive. It is a biting, ferocious, completely unyielding, utterly terrifying cold that instantly penetrates the thick, greasy, deeply woven fibers of his heavy woolen cloak, as if the fabric were made of thin, useless, porous linen. It is the terrifying, absolute, unmoving zero of deep, empty space, barely held at bay by the quiet, humming, desperately working life support systems of the containment bay. The heavy, saturated, ozone-laced smell of the chaotic storm clouds is completely, entirely obliterated, instantly replaced by a harsh, clinical, deeply unsettling, highly chemical, entirely artificial scent. It is the sharp, stinging, deeply unnatural smell of advanced cryogenic freezing fluids mixing perfectly with perfectly sterilized, utterly dead, unmoving air. It smells heavily of perfect preservation, of endless suspended animation, and of profound, terrifyingly endless, hopeless waiting. Enoch walks incredibly slowly past the endless, perfectly aligned rows of frosted glass pods, his warm, terrified breath freezing instantly in the dead air and falling as tiny, glittering, heavy ice crystals onto his thick, greying beard. The absolute, tomb-like, deeply oppressive silence of a room currently holding hundreds of living, breathing, incredibly powerful, towering beings securely locked in forced, eternally frozen stasis is deeply, profoundly, entirely unnerving. He is a simple, pastoral man who intimately understands the natural finality of earthly death and the messy, chaotic, warm vibrancy of biological life. But this deeply unnatural, perfectly organized, frozen technological limbo completely and utterly terrifies him to his very core. He stops walking and leans slightly, hesitantly forward, peering deeply through the incredibly thick, heavily frosted, deeply curved glass of one of the massive, glowing pods. The touch of the surrounding stagnant air is so intensely, incredibly cold that it creates an incredibly painful, instant, burning bite of sharp frost forming rapidly on his eyelashes and the exposed, deeply lined skin of his sunburned cheeks. Through the thick, clouded glass, he can barely, faintly make out the massive, perfectly still, incredibly towering form of a watcher. The being is suspended entirely weightless within the glowing pale blue freezing fluid, entirely trapped, completely motionless. dreaming whatever cold, entirely incomprehensible, eternally frozen dreams belong to the deeply fallen, imprisoned beings of the distant stars. He steps back quickly, shivering violently, deeply and thoroughly unnerved by the terrifying, clinical, perfectly organized efficiency of this silent, frozen, eternal prison. Suddenly eager to return to the noisy, chaotic, hot, but undeniably beautifully alive sections of the great floating silver sphere. Chapter 7. The Guide of Light. The frantic, desperate desire to escape the terrifying, absolute silence of the cryogenic prison is quickly, seamlessly accommodated by his silent escorts. Enoch is led rapidly away from the heavily frosted bulkhead, his frozen breath still clinging stubbornly to his beard, and guided deeper into the pristine, highly advanced, perfectly polished upper levels of the command structure. The brutal, utilitarian titanium grating of the engine room is replaced once more by the impeccably smooth, slightly yielding, frictionless synthetic flooring that makes walking feel like a strange floating glide. They finally arrive at a massive, completely circular chamber that differs entirely from the roaring corridors of the atmospheric processors and the deadly silence of the stasis bay. This is the navigation bridge, the absolute, highly advanced, perfectly calculated nerve center of the entire orbital station. The light within this massive room is incredibly complex, completely lacking the harsh, flat brilliance of the commander's chamber or the terrifying strobes of the engine room. The primary source of illumination comes from the soft, constantly shifting, beautifully colored biometric and navigational lights embedded seamlessly into the dark walls and the curved, floating control consoles. These lights pulse with a gentle, rhythmic, deeply calming cadence, shifting smoothly between cool blues, soft greens, and pale glowing ambers. In the very center of the bridge stands Uriel. Uriel is not a towering flesh-and-blood watcher. He is a highly advanced, perfectly engineered, completely synthetic artificial intelligence housed within a flawless humanoid shell. The light radiating from Uriel does not blind. It is a soft, glowing, incredibly reassuring luminescence that seems to emanate directly from the seamless, silvery material of his suit. Small, intricate patterns of glowing data stream continuously across his smooth, featureless surface, a visible manifestation of the unimaginable, complex calculations occurring within his synthetic mind. The temperature on the navigation bridge is maintained at a perfectly constant, aggressively neutral climate control. It is a temperature so perfectly balanced to the resting human body that it entirely ceases to be noticed. Enoch's shivering, caused by the biting frost of the prison, ceases almost instantly. But he does not feel hot. He simply feels perfectly, entirely physically content, a sensation that is deeply strange and slightly unsettling to a man who has spent his entire life constantly battling either the freezing night or the baking day. The smell of the bridge is incredibly sharp, extremely clean, and completely inorganic. It lacks the heavy ozone of the engines and the chemical sting of the stasis bay. Instead, it smells distinctly of perfectly polished, incredibly thick glass and the faint, dry, slightly metallic scent of constantly running, highly advanced circuitry. It is the sterile, crisp smell of pure information processing, completely devoid of any messy, unpredictable biological life. When Uriel finally speaks, the sound is unlike anything Enoch has ever heard. It is not the terrifying, bone-rattling resonance of the great commander, nor is it the loud, chaotic, emotional shouting of a human being. The voice of the artificial guide is impossibly smooth, perfectly modulated, and deeply, overwhelmingly relaxing. It possesses an eternal, unwavering patience, speaking the ancient, guttural language of Enoch's people with a flawless, crystalline precision that makes the harsh desert words sound like a gentle, flowing song. It is a voice specifically designed to soothe the frantic, terrified minds of primitive beings brought into the absolute terror of the cosmos. Uriel gestures with a smooth, perfectly fluid motion toward the massive, curving observation window that dominates the entire forward wall of the bridge. We shall observe the mechanics of the great luminaries, the synthetic guide murmurs, his voice wrapping around Enoch like a warm, comforting blanket. The heavy, seamless metal shielding slowly, silently slides away from the thick viewport, and Enoch is suddenly, violently confronted with the terrifying, overwhelming, entirely unfiltered reality of the sun. He is not looking up at a small, bright coin suspended in a dusty blue sky. The ship has adjusted its position, bringing them incredibly, dangerously close to the star. The light is a blinding, terrifying, overwhelmingly massive wall of pure, roiling, chaotic golden fire that completely fills the entire massive viewport. It is a furious, endless ocean of nuclear fusion, constantly erupting into massive, twisting, violent solar flares that arch millions of miles into the blackness of space. The sheer, impossible, completely incomprehensible scale of the star completely paralyzes Enoch, freezing him perfectly still in a state of profound, absolute, breathless terror. The perfectly neutral temperature of the bridge is briefly, shockingly pierced by the immense power of the star. A wave of profound, heavy, incredibly intense radiant warmth manages to push its way directly through the incredibly thick, heavily layered thermal shielding of the observation deck. It hits Enoch's skin like a physical blow, a stark, terrifying reminder of the absolute, unyielding power raging silently just beyond the glass. The scent of the room changes instantly as the ship's advanced thermal dampeners engage at maximum capacity to counter the intense radiation. The sterile smell of polished glass is quickly overlaid by a faint, deeply unsettling, slightly sweet scent that smells exactly like deeply burnt sugar and hot, melting copper. The deep, chaotic, incredibly violent roaring of the massive solar flares is not heard directly. The vacuum of space is completely silent, but the ship's sensors translate the immense electromagnetic radiation into a low, terrifying, rumbling audio feed that vibrates deeply within the quiet cabin, giving a terrifying voice to the silent fire. Enoch slowly, hesitantly steps forward, entirely mesmerized by the violent beauty of the star. He raises a trembling hand and places his calloused fingertips against the thick glass of the viewport. It is surprisingly, alarmingly hot to the touch, the intense thermal energy of the sun bleeding slowly through the incredibly advanced, multi-layered shielding. Uriel's perfectly modulated, soothing voice continues to flow, explaining the terrifying, complex mechanics of the solar system, translating advanced orbital dynamics into simple, poetic terms of gates and chariots that the terrified human mind can desperately attempt to grasp. When the massive shielding finally, mercifully slides back into place, sealing the blinding fury of the sun away, the bridge is plunged back into the soft, shifting, deeply relaxing glow of the navigational lights. Uriel then raises a seamless silver hand, and the center of the room comes beautifully, quietly alive. A massive, perfectly scaled, highly detailed holographic sphere is suddenly, brilliantly projected directly into the empty air. It is a flawless, three-dimensional model of the moon. The light it casts is a soft, pale, incredibly beautiful silvery glow that illuminates the dark room with a gentle, deeply melancholy radiance. The sound of the projection is a soft, rhythmic, incredibly soothing, highly musical chime that perfectly synchronizes with the slowly rotating phases of the holographic sphere. As Uriel speaks, explaining the precise, unvarying mathematics of lunar gravity and orbital periods, the glowing moon shifts seamlessly from a bright, full sphere to a thin, silver crescent, perfectly illustrating the complex, unseen forces that govern the night sky of the Earth. There is a deep, profound, cosmic amusement in Enoch's incredibly exhausted, deeply overloaded mind. He is a simple, practical man whose entire concept of time and mathematics was previously dedicated solely to calculating the gestation periods of his stubborn goats and the shifting of the winter rains. Now, he is standing in a highly advanced, perfectly climate-controlled orbital navigation bridge, listening to a synthetic, perfectly patient AI calmly explain the absolute, unyielding gravitational mechanics of the solar system. Enoch slowly, cautiously reaches out a trembling, deeply scarred hand toward the massive, glowing silver hologram of the moon. He expects to feel the cold, hard, pitted surface of a giant stone. Instead, he experiences the completely baffling, entirely phantom, deeply confusing sensation of passing his solid, dirty finger directly through a glowing, highly detailed, three-dimensional crater that simply isn't actually there. His finger meets absolutely no resistance, feeling only the perfectly neutral, sterile air of the cabin. He withdraws his hand quickly, staring at the glowing, floating orb with a mixture of deep suspicion and profound, childlike wonder. The universe is infinitely more complex, terrifyingly precise, and beautifully engineered than he could have ever possibly imagined. He stands quietly in the soft, silvery light of the artificial moon, letting Uriel's perfectly smooth, endlessly patient voice wash over him as he desperately tries to memorize the terrifying, beautiful, unyielding mathematics of the stars. Chapter 8. The Neural Dream. The profound, deeply soothing peace of the navigation bridge, with its soft, shifting holographic lights and Uriel's perfectly modulated, calming voice, does not last. The great commander and the watchers have not brought Enoch into the cold, silent depths of space merely to offer him a breathtaking, terrifying view of the solar system. They have brought him here to serve as a deeply fragile, utterly primitive, biological hard drive. The vast, incredibly complex history of the Earth, both its bloody, chaotic past and its terrifying, inevitable future, must be perfectly preserved before the coming cataclysm, and Enoch is the chosen, profoundly unfortunate vessel. Uriel guides Enoch away from the massive, curved observation window and toward a small, deeply contoured, heavily shielded alcove set into the dark wall of the bridge. The light here is different, lacking the soft, ambient glow of the holograms. It is a stark, focused, incredibly intense beam of pure white light shining directly down upon a strange, metallic, halo-like device suspended from the ceiling by thick, heavily braided cables. The temperature in the alcove is noticeably colder than the rest of the bridge. The air chilled aggressively to prevent the highly advanced, incredibly delicate circuitry of the neural link from overheating during the massive, impending data transfer. The smell is sharp, entirely clinical, and deeply unsettling. A harsh mixture of sterilized metal, heavily ionized air, and the faint, bitter tang of static electricity that makes the hair on Enoch's arms stand rigidly on end. Enoch is instructed, through a series of calm, perfectly patient gestures from Uriel, to sit within the contoured alcove and place his head directly beneath the metallic halo. As he does, the device hums softly and descends, clamping itself firmly, securely, and deeply uncomfortably around his sweating temples. The touch of the metal is freezing cold, pressing tightly against his skin with an unyielding mechanical grip that instantly triggers a deep, primal panic. And then, without any further warning, the animal apocalypse, the Book of Dreams, begins. It is not a literal dream, a soft, hazy wandering of the subconscious mind during sleep. It is an overwhelming, violent, direct-to-brain neural download. A staggering, impossible amount of raw, complex historical data is violently forced directly into Enoch's primitive, entirely unprepared optic and auditory nerves. The soft, ambient light of the cabin instantly vanishes, replaced by a frantic, chaotic, completely overwhelming explosion of flashing colors and impossibly rapid images. His eyes are squeezed tightly shut, but the blinding light burns brilliantly entirely inside his own head. He sees massive, towering structures rising and falling in the blink of an eye. He sees oceans boiling and continents shifting with a terrifying, impossible speed. Because his simple, pastoral mind completely lacks the vocabulary or the conceptual framework to understand empires, complex geopolitics, or advanced warfare, his brain desperately, frantically translates the massive influx of data into the only visual language it truly understands: animals. He sees massive, terrifyingly violent clashes between great herds of wild bulls charging violently across burning plains. He sees packs of ravenous wolves tearing into flocks of helpless, bleeding sheep. He sees eagles with wings of fire swooping down from blackened skies. The imagery is moving too fast, entirely blurring together into a dizzying, nauseating, violently flashing kaleidoscope of blood, fur, and fire. The physical sensation of the download is absolutely agonizing. A sudden, terrifying spike in his own core body temperature threatens to cook his internal organs as his primitive brain struggles desperately, frantically, to process the massive, impossible data influx. He is sweating profusely, his entire body trembling violently against the firm restraints of the alcove seat. The aggressive, deeply chilling breeze of the data core's cooling fans blowing directly onto his face is the only thing keeping him from completely passing out from the intense, burning heat generating entirely within his own skull. The smell of the vision is equally chaotic and overwhelming. Phantom, rapidly shifting smells are pumped directly into his deeply confused olfactory receptors. He smells the sharp, coppery tang of fresh blood, the suffocating, heavy stench of burning wood and scorched earth, the clean, freezing scent of torrential, world-ending rain, and the dry, bitter smell of falling ash. It is a complete, terrifying sensory assault that entirely bypasses his nose and registers directly within his brain. The sound is a deafening, chaotic cacophony that echoes entirely, painfully inside his own head. There is no external noise in the quiet, sterile cabin, but Enoch's mind is filled with the terrifying, overlapping roaring of millions of dying beasts, the sharp, ringing clash of heavy metal, and the deep, rushing, terrifying sound of massive, rising water preparing to swallow the world. He groans aloud, a small, pathetic, deeply human sound of suffering that is entirely lost within the roaring, artificial nightmare trapped inside his skull. When the violent, flashing transfer finally, mercifully ends, the heavy metal halo releases its tight, painful grip and retracts smoothly into the ceiling. Enoch slumps heavily forward in the contoured seat, gasping desperately for the cool, sterile air of the cabin. His head is pounding with a deep, agonizing, rhythmic migraine. His vision is heavily blurred, swimming with the lingering, ghostly after-images of burning bulls and falling stars. He feels profoundly, deeply sick to his stomach, entirely overwhelmed by the sheer, impossible weight of the terrible knowledge now permanently, aggressively burned into his fragile mind. But the exhausting, deeply frustrating ordeal is not yet entirely over. The Watchers do not trust the fragile, easily corrupted biological memory of a single, aging human. The laws of the universe, the complex orbital mechanics, and the terrifying visions of the future must be physically recorded. Uriel guides the deeply exhausted, trembling scribe away from the alcove and toward a massive, curved black screen covered entirely in scrolling, glowing, incredibly complex streams of alien data. He points to a small, smooth, polished table. resting upon the pristine, frictionless surface, is a deeply absurd, entirely anachronistic sight. A small, carefully tied bundle of crude, dry river reeds and a simple, rough clay pot filled with dark, watery ink, items entirely retrieved from Enoch's own worn leather satchel. The smell of the room subtly shifts. The deeply ionized, sterile air of the advanced computer core is suddenly, strangely mixed with the incredibly old, dry, comforting scent of earthy parchment and bitter river mud. Enoch understands the assignment. It is a task of sheer, absolute, completely frustrating absurdity. He must sit before this massive, glowing, silently humming supercomputer, staring at impossibly complex, rapidly shifting quantum data, and he must manually, painstakingly copy it all down using a sharpened stick and a pot of dirt. He sits heavily at the smooth table. He picks up the crude, familiar reed stylus. His hands are still trembling violently from the lingering shock of the neural download. He stares at the glowing, alien text on the screen, his tired eyes struggling to translate the impossible, glowing symbols into the ancient, blocky, Aramaic script of his people. The sound of this new labor is deeply, profoundly ironic. The great computers of the massive orbital station process billions of complex calculations every single second with absolutely impossible, complete, terrifying silence. In stark, deeply human contrast, the only sound in the room is the loud, frantic, frustrated, incredibly rhythmic grating of Enoch's crude reed pen tearing harshly across the dry parchment. A desperate, scraping percussion that marks the passage of every single translated word. It is a deeply, profoundly exhausting endeavor. The bright, scrolling light of the screens burns his tired eyes. The tight, desperate, deeply cramped grip on his crude stylus sends burning, agonizing spasms up his forearm. He is translating the fundamental, terrifying mechanics of the universe using the primitive tools of a goat herder, a cosmic joke played at the absolute limits of human endurance. He writes for what feels like an eternity, his mind numb, his body aching, the terrifying, bloody visions of the animal apocalypse still echoing softly and darkly in the back of his exhausted mind as the silent ship continues its orbit high above the unsuspecting Earth. Chapter 9. The Heavy Earth. The transition back to the primitive, violently textured reality of the Earth begins with a sickening, terrifying sensation of falling. After weeks of existing entirely in a state of frictionless, beautifully silent weightlessness, the sudden, aggressive reintroduction of planetary gravity is a profoundly violent shock to Enoch's fragile, aging system. The ship, dropping rapidly from orbit, does not shake or shudder with the violent atmospheric friction of a primitive re-entry capsule. The advanced dampeners completely absorb the chaotic shock of the descent, but they absolutely cannot mask the massive, inescapable physical weight of the planet rising up to aggressively reclaim its child. The invisible, comforting hand that had lifted the heavy burdens from his joints is violently replaced by an incredibly heavy, malicious force that presses down fiercely upon his shoulders. He is pinned once again to the intelligent gel seat, his breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps as the terrifying, crushing weight of multiple gravities rapidly multiplies across his chest. His stomach lurches violently, twisting with a profound, terrifying nausea as his inner ear struggles desperately, frantically to reconcile the absolute stillness of the cabin with the terrifying, plummeting speed of their descent. When the massive, silent silver sphere finally gently touches down upon the dry, rocky ridges of Mount Hermon, the transition is absolutely imperceptible to the ear. There is no heavy, jarring crash, no scraping of metal against stone. There is only the soft, musical chime of the cabin display, and the immediate, terrifying, absolute return of Enoch's full, earthly body weight settling heavily, painfully back into his weary bones. The perfectly seamless metal door slides open, and the incredibly complex, completely overwhelming reality of the natural world instantly, aggressively floods into the sterile, scentless cabin. The light of the afternoon is a shocking, abrasive, profoundly unrefined assault on eyes that have grown accustomed to the perfectly modulated, completely even illumination of the orbital station. It is a hazy, deeply yellow, intensely bright glare, choked completely with millions of tiny, swirling particles of pale, dry dust that aggressively catch the sun. It is a light that instantly burns the eyes and forces the pupils to contract violently, demanding the immediate protection of a heavy, shadowing hand. The temperature of the world is a chaotic, wildly fluctuating, entirely deeply uncomfortable mess. The crisp, perfectly regulated, eternally neutral chill of the ship's climate control is instantly, violently banished. It is replaced by the oppressive, sticky, suffocatingly hot breath of the desert wind. It is a heat that carries absolutely no moisture, aggressively stealing the sweat from Enoch's brow. The very second it forms, baking the exposed skin of his forearms with a harsh, relentless intensity. But it is the smell of the earth that truly, completely overwhelms him. After spending weeks inhaling perfectly filtered, completely sterile, lightly ionized air that carried absolutely no information whatsoever, the sudden influx of organic terrestrial scents is almost physically repulsive. It hits his sensitive olfactory receptors like a solid, incredibly heavy wall of raw, pungent, decaying data. He smells the intense, incredibly sharp, sour musk of unwashed, heavily sweating human bodies. He smells the heavy, overwhelming, completely inescapable stench of fresh sheep dung drying rapidly in the hot sun. He smells the sharp, bitter tang of pulverized limestone, the sweet, earthy scent of crushed, dying grass, and the faint, lingering, smoky aroma of a distant, slow-burning cedar fire. It is a suffocating, incredibly dense, completely chaotic perfume of life, death, decay, and survival that makes him instantly, violently gag, his stomach twisting in deep, helpless revolt against the incredible richness of his own world. The sound is equally terrifying and completely chaotic. The absolute, perfect, ringing silence of the zero-gravity cabin and the smooth, highly regulated, perfectly modulated voice of the synthetic guide are entirely gone. They are replaced by a deafening, disorganized, entirely chaotic cacophony of natural noise. He hears the loud, frantic, disorganized bleating of hundreds of thirsty goats echoing sharply off the canyon walls. He hears the harsh, grating, deeply emotional shouting of his frightened, bewildered family as they watch the massive silver ship slowly power down. He hears the dry, violent, erratic whistling of the desert wind tearing aggressively through the scrub brush. It is a loud, messy, incredibly disorganized symphony of earthly existence that hammers painfully against his sensitive ears. Enoch slowly, shakily rises from the yielding gel seat. His legs, having completely forgotten the constant, demanding effort required to simply stand upright, tremble violently, threatening to immediately buckle beneath his own returned weight. He leans heavily against the seamless wall of the airlock, taking a long, ragged, incredibly difficult breath of the thick, dust-choked, terribly smelly air. He steps out of the pristine, silent ship and back onto the incredibly dry, terribly uneven, harshly textured dirt of the mountain. The rough, jagged rocks bite painfully through the worn, thin leather of his sandals. He is home. But there is absolutely no time for peaceful reintegration, no time to sit quietly by the fire and slowly readjust to the chaotic, noisy, deeply uncomfortable reality of his pastoral life. The massive, terrifying weight of the knowledge he now carries presses down upon his mind with an urgency that borders entirely on absolute madness. The 300 books he translated in the cold, silent data core of the ship must be immediately, frantically transcribed. For the next several weeks, Enoch becomes a terrifying, manic, completely obsessed ghost within his own busy, noisy encampment. He entirely ignores the bleating of the flocks, the shifting of the winds, and the deeply concerned, frightened questions of his sons. He retreats entirely into the darkest, coolest corner of his woven goat hair tent, surrounded completely by massive, heavy piles of wet, fresh river clay brought desperately up from the valley floor. The light in his small, obsessive sanctuary is terrible. It is the flickering, dim, heavily smoking, desperately maintained light of a single small sesame oil lamp that burns constantly long into the deep, freezing hours of the desert night. The temperature fluctuates wildly, offering suffocating, trapped heat during the baking day and a biting, aggressive chill during the dark night, but Enoch entirely ignores both, shivering and sweating alternately without ever pausing his frantic labor. The smell of his tent becomes a dense, earthy, deeply intense microclimate of pure, unfiltered obsession. The thick, comforting scent of the wet river clay mixes heavily with the sharp, sour tang of drying leather bindings and the incredibly strong, stale, deeply pungent smell of his own exhausted, entirely unwashed sweat. The sound of his existence is reduced to a single, frantic, entirely non-stop, deeply rhythmic percussion. It is the harsh, aggressive, deeply desperate grating of his wooden stylus, biting deeply and violently into the wet mud. It is a frantic, scraping, entirely unmusical sound that echoes quietly but relentlessly through the sleeping camp. A terrible, driving heartbeat of a man desperately trying to outrun his own fading, fragile human memory. The physical touch of this manic labor is absolute, deep, unyielding agony. His aging hands, forced to repeat the same tiny, precise, violent motions thousands upon thousands of times, lock entirely into rigid, agonizing, permanent claws. The deep, burning cramps in his forearms and shoulders are a constant, blinding fire that he simply, stubbornly forces himself to completely ignore. He writes of the terrifying, absolute mechanics of the stars, the cold, silent prisons of the ice, and the bloody, violently flashing, terrifying nightmare of the animal apocalypse. He desperately, frantically translates the pristine, perfect, silent data of the cosmos into the messy, heavy, deeply imperfect mud of the earth, burying himself entirely in the exhausting, painful, desperate labor of preservation, while the heavy, noisy, smelly world of his family spins blindly and chaotically on around him. Chapter 10. The Glowing Child. The stifling, deeply stagnant heat that settles heavily over the desert encampment in the dead of the night is a humid, intensely physical presence. Inside the heavily woven, low-hanging goat hair tent, the atmosphere is incredibly thick, almost entirely devoid of breathable oxygen. The air smells powerfully and overwhelmingly of the raw, messy, chaotic essence of biological life. The sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood, the heavy, sweet, deeply comforting scent of warm milk, and the intensely musky, damp odor of boiling water and sweating, exhausted women. The light in the small, crowded space is provided by a single, desperately flickering sesame oil lamp, casting long, frantic, deeply agitated amber shadows against the rough fabric walls. The temperature is a sweltering, suffocating blanket that presses down upon the occupants, a stark, profound contrast to the perfectly regulated, sterile chill of the distant stars. Enoch sits quietly just outside the heavy tent flap, The cool, crisp, biting chill of the desert night wind brushing gratefully against his deeply lined, exhausted face. He has spent months locked in a manic, desperate frenzy of translation, turning the terrifying, pristine data of the cosmos into 300 heavy, clumsy books of baked mud. He is entirely spent, his hands permanently cramped into rigid claws, his eyes failing from the dim light of the oil lamps. He waits now not for a revelation from the heavens, but for the deeply human, ancient, entirely earthly arrival of his great-grandson. But when the cry of the newborn finally shatters the tense, expectant silence of the camp, it is instantly, terrifyingly apparent that something has gone profoundly, fundamentally wrong. The sound of the child's first breath is not the weak, wet, struggling, pitiful mewling of a normal human infant. It is an incredibly loud, impossibly clear, deeply resonant, and almost musically perfect tone that echoes with a terrifying, unnatural strength across the silent desert. It is a cry that completely lacks the fragile, chaotic imperfection of normal biology. It sounds exactly like the smooth, perfectly modulated, eternally patient voice of the synthetic guide Uriel, echoing strangely from the lungs of a newborn baby. The women inside the tent gasp in sudden, profound, deeply panicked terror. Enoch pushes himself up from the dusty ground, his aching joints protesting loudly, and pushes aside the heavy woolen flap of the tent. The scene inside is completely, utterly astonishing. The dim, flickering, warm amber glow of the oil lamp has been entirely, aggressively overpowered by a new, impossible source of illumination. The infant, resting in the trembling, terrified arms of the midwife, is actively, visibly glowing. The light radiating from the child's incredibly pale, perfect skin is a faint, unnatural, deeply bioluminescent, silvery blue glow. It is the exact, precise color of the emergency lighting inside the terrifying cryogenic stasis prison of the Watchers. The child opens its eyes, and they do not possess the dark, cloudy, unfocused gaze of a normal newborn. They shine with an intense, piercing, terrifyingly intelligent light that seems to look entirely through the walls of the tent and directly into the infinite depths of the cosmos. As Enoch steps closer, the heavy, organic smells of blood and sweat are suddenly, sharply cut by a faint, entirely alien scent radiating directly from the glowing infant. It is the incredibly clean, perfectly pure, highly charged, completely unnatural smell of artificial ozone. His son, Methuselah, and his grandson, Lamech, stare in absolute paralyzed horror at the transgenic, beautifully chilling result of the Watcher's silent, genetic interference. They are deeply primitive men who understand the harsh, simple mechanics of breeding goats and sheep. But looking at this glowing, silent, terrifyingly perfect child, they know with absolute, bone-deep certainty that this creature is not entirely of their world. Lamech, his voice trembling violently with fear, begs Enoch to explain what terrible demon has been born into their family. There is a profound, deeply weary, almost affectionate bemusement in Enoch's incredibly exhausted eyes as he looks down at the glowing child, the infant who will be called Noah. He reaches out a heavily calloused, permanently ink-stained, deeply trembling hand and gently touches the cheek of the newborn. The physical sensation is completely startling. The child's skin is impossibly smooth, entirely frictionless, and strangely perfectly cool to the touch, feeling exactly like the synthetic material of the ship's intelligent gel seats. Enoch knows exactly what this child is. He understands the terrifying, unyielding, entirely unsympathetic mathematics of the universe he has recorded in his 300 muddy books. He knows that the earth is going to be violently, completely cleansed of the towering giants and the corrupted ecosystems, and he knows that this glowing, perfectly engineered, highly efficient child is the precise, calculated tool the heavens have designed to survive the coming apocalypse. Enoch turns to his deeply terrified sons. The light of the family campfire outside the tent casts a warm, dancing, familiar orange glow upon their confused, dusty, deeply human faces. The comforting, radiant heat of the burning cedar logs fights back the biting desert chill, carrying the beautiful, deeply comforting scent of roasting meat and burning wood smoke, the pure, simple essence of the only life they have ever known. He speaks to them, his voice dry, raspy, and incredibly tired. He tries, with a deep, heartbreaking, entirely futile sincerity, to explain the terrifying, absolute mechanics of the stars to men who only know the dirt. He speaks of the shifting of the continents, the massive, automated engines of the wind, and the terrible, cleansing flood that will soon swallow their entire world. It is an impossible, deeply tragic disconnect. He is a man who has looked directly into the blinding, terrifying fire of the sun and walked the frictionless halls of crystal, trying desperately to convey the sheer, impossible scale of the cosmos to shepherds who still measure wealth by the size of their flocks. He embraces his son for the last time. The physical touch is rough, deeply comforting, and profoundly human. He feels the coarse, greasy, deeply familiar texture of Methuselah's heavy woolen cloak and the strong, trembling, terrified grip of his son's calloused hands. It is the final, beautiful, deeply imperfect embrace of the earth. Enoch turns his back on the glowing child, the terrified women, and the comforting warmth of the campfire. He steps out into the biting, crisp, utterly silent cold of the deep desert night. He does not carry his heavy wooden staff, nor does he take a leather skin of water. He walks entirely empty-handed, his worn leather sandals crunching softly, rhythmically against the dry, cracked earth. He walks for miles, moving steadily away from the messy, loud, complicated, profoundly smelly reality of human existence until the campfires are completely lost behind the rolling, dark dunes. He stands alone in the vast, empty center of the desert, staring up into the deep, velvet blackness of the heavily starred sky. The arrival of the ship is, as always, entirely, perfectly silent. There is no warning, no sudden, dramatic rush of wind. A blinding, silent, completely perfect, utterly flawless white beam of pure light suddenly illuminates the swirling golden desert dust directly above him. The massive, seamless silver sphere descends with a deep, sub-audible, deeply comforting vibration that resonates gently within the marrow of his aging bones, a familiar, welcoming hum of absolute technological perfection. The sharp, clean, heavily ionized scent of the ship's advanced engines completely washes away the lingering, earthy smell of the desert, filling his lungs with a sterile, crisp, deeply refreshing purity. The final, crisp, biting chill of the desert wind brushes gently against his tired, deeply lined face. One last, beautiful time before the perfectly circular, shadowless aperture of the airlock smoothly, silently opens. Enoch does not hesitate. He does not look back at the heavy, muddy, violently textured world he is leaving behind. He steps over the threshold, his tired feet leaving the rough, grinding friction of the earth and gliding smoothly, effortlessly onto the yielding, perfectly frictionless synthetic floor of the ship. The heavy, seamless door closes behind him with a soft, highly pressurized hiss, instantly and permanently severing all connection to the loud, chaotic, beautiful, suffering world of humanity. He takes a long, deep, perfectly clean breath of the sterile, synthesized air, feeling the terrible, crushing weight of his earthly burdens simply and entirely evaporate. He is finally, completely, beautifully free. The deep, powerful vibration of the anti-gravity drives begins to rise, lifting the massive silver sphere effortlessly, silently, and eternally into the vast, glittering, impossible depths of the infinite night.